Chapter 5, The American Revolution, 1763 to 1783. The crisis begins. And as I mentioned to you Monday, the crisis was the end of the French and Indian War. Since we're not going to be in class, I thought this would be the best way to make sure you get it done. After the war is over, King George III of England wants to consolidate the empire and make sure that the colonies are, shall we say, behaving themselves like good Englishmen. And he imposed an awful lot of trading regulations against them. And as I mentioned also Monday, during those 7 Years' War, there was little respect between the American troops and the troops from England. So after the war, the English troops looked down on us and we looked down on them. Plus, the whole time we're being taxed. Now, these two words you do need to know the difference of. The word virtual representation. When we start saying, well, hey, why can you tax us? If we're going to tax us, shouldn't we have some representation in Parliament? And we were told that all British subjects are represented, just like you would expect a senator from Texas to take care of issues in South Carolina. We were represented by someone in Congress. Well, we all know that's not the case. It was just a word they were throwing out to say that because you are English, you are represented. But to combat some of the smuggling, they began issuing something called blanket search warrants. Now, in our country, when you issue a search warrant, you have to specify what you are looking for. This blanket search warrant was issued by the English government that you could go into a home or check a ship out and just look to see whatever you could find. You didn't have to specify anything, which really irritated the people who owned the ships. They passed a Sugar Act, a Revenue Act, a Currency Act, and meanwhile, all these taxes on everything every time we turn around, the colonists are totally outraged. You're infringing on my liberties as Englishmen. Then the Stamp Act crisis. And we really hear this taxation and representation. We hear no taxation without representation, and we're not just going to send one representative from the whole colony over there to be in the Parliament. Something's got to be done. And the Stamp Act was simply, well, if you've ever bought a pack of cigarettes, you'll see that little stamp across the top. That's a stamp. Basically, what the Stamp Act was, it was a tax on anything that was paper. This, of course, would irritate the lower class, the people along the docks, buying cards and buying newspapers and buying, anything made of paper they had to pay a tax on. And it would also irritate the upper class because you had the lawyers and the judges who were dealing with paper all the time. So you've got two groups of people that are very irritated over this stupid tax. They think it's stupid. And in a way it is. It's a small amount, but it still should never have been issued. So then they come up with the idea, well, if they don't have any stamps, they can't make us pay a tax, right? So they formed committees to eliminate the tax stamp. And they would disguise themselves as various forms of different people and go into the tax office and burn the stamps. And sometimes they would take the tax collector out and tar and feather him. They also decided to boycott all English goods. Well, the English were using us as a pretty good store, so to speak. We were buying most everything from them, and once we stopped buying, it started hurting the merchants in England, and the merchants in England came back and said, this stamp tax is really ridiculous. Let's get rid of it. So it was repealed. And we're very happy because it showed that, by acting together as a unit, we could get things done. Besides that, the king listened to us. So the Stamp Act was repealed, but then Parliament issued something called the Declaratory Act, which was like a spite for little kids. Says, okay, we repealed it now, but I do withhold the right to tax you in the future. So they're declaring they can still tax us. A group called the Regulators in South Carolina, which was nothing more than small landowners, began to join in protest against some of these taxes. And in North Carolina, they joined in, and guess what? The protests in North and South Carolina were put down by the North and South Carolina militia. A group called the Sons of Liberty in the Hudson River Valley area of New York stopped paying rents and began to take over large land holdings because of taxes. And again, the New York State militia put down the uprising. And you think this would be a red flag in England that something's going on in the colonies. Why are all these people causing so much problem? But they're not paying any attention. And then something called the Townshend crisis. Well, Mr. Townshend was the CFO, Chief Financial Officer of the British Exchequer. And he set all taxes on everything coming into this country. So he set a tax on all imported goods into the colonies. He established what was called a new board of trade in the colonies so that we wouldn't have any be able to do any smuggling or not pay the taxes. And oh man, this really ticked the colonists off. Just what is going on? So they came up with this idea of homespun virtue. The colonies are going to let Mother England know what's what. So they decided again to boycott all English goods. And Boston became the center of resistance because basically this is where the news came in at, that it was a big port, and ships were always coming in from all over the world in England, and this is where the biggest resistance pocket was. It's a very small little YouTube here. Hopefully it will play. Aha. Well, maybe it will and maybe it won't. Here we go. It's a very short one.
Silversmith and political radical Paul Revere captures the moment British soldiers kill 5 colonists in the streets of Boston.
Bigger.
His engraving will fuel the fires of revolution.
There we go.
As outrage spreads across the 13 colonies. March 5th, 1770. After 3 days of unrest, an angry mob roams the streets. Hundreds of men who lost their jobs and blame the British gather on King Street and face off against 8 redcoats with orders not to fire. What's about to happen will change America forever. A 17-year-old wigmaker's apprentice, Edward Garrick, lights the fuse. This is how wars start. Private Hugh Montgomery is hit with a club. An African-American, Crispus Attucks, dies instantly. When the smoke clears, 4 more are dead.
Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore, thy hallowed walks besmeared with guiltless gore, while faithless Preston and his savage bands, with murderous rancor, stretch their bloody hands.
The most formidable army in the world, firing on an unarmed crowd. An explosive image with a title that says it all. The Bloody Massacre. Silversmith and political radical Paul Revere.
I want to give you just a little bit more background because this is basically going to be about the 2 pictures, the Boston Massacre. Just as so many people here in this country blame unjustifiably the Mexicans for coming in and taking their jobs, this is pretty much what was happening in Boston. Now, these young men who were stationed here, who were redcoats, they were in the military, their pay was not forthcoming as frequently as it should have been, and so they were looking for part-time jobs, although there's not several hundred of them here. They would go around and say, can I get a day's work here to, on the docks, loading or unloading a boat? Can I do this? And of course, it became a blame that because we can't get a job because the military is taking it all. And one warehouse owner in Boston who was very rich, very well known, name was John Hancock, by the way. He was also well respected as being a smuggler of things. He didn't pay taxes very often. So one group of men went to the warehouse and we heard there's a ship coming in. Could we possibly hire on to help you unload the ship? Well, the guy who was in charge of the warehouse said, sure, come on back tomorrow and we'll let you unload. Well, after the guys left, they got to talking amongst themselves and they decided, that was too easy. Since when did we have a Bostonian that's that nice? Maybe we better not go back. Well, they were right. The guy who was in charge of the warehouse, not Paul Revere or not John Hancock, but just a warehouse worker, planned on having a gang there. They were going to beat up the guys when they showed up. Well, they didn't show up, so they go out drinking. So this is part of the mob that's going to show up. They're going to attack 7 soldiers who've been given orders not to shoot because you can't. An English soldier cannot shoot an English citizen. It's against the law. You just can't do it. So they were ordered not to shoot. But the men in the mob, and there were several hundred of them there, they were throwing snowballs, yes, but the snowballs had like rocks and things in them. They were spitting on them. They were calling them names. And like the little YouTube just showed you, one of the young men got hit, but another one of the soldiers got knocked down. It was just a brawl waiting to happen. And all of a sudden, and we don't know for sure, although there is a program on television called History's Mysteries that's analyzed this, and they came up with an idea that you can see from these 2 pictures in the background, you've got the church and the courthouse, and you've got the men standing on the side with the barracks behind the men, that someone from the mob kept yelling, shoot, shoot, shoot. And all of a sudden, one of the soldiers admitted that he had heard from the back of him someone yell, shoot. He thought it was his commanding officer, so he shot. Well, it was proven in court later on that it was one of the mob who had worked his way behind the soldiers and were yelling, shoot. So basically, the crowd instigated the shooting. Well, I don't think they were hoping anybody's going to get killed, but they were hoping somebody was going to get wounded. And of course, Christus Atticus, the black man who was a former slave who was killed, became the symbol of everything. Now these 2 pictures. Paul Revere's picture, he's the one, since we didn't have newspapers, we didn't have CNN, we didn't have Fox News, all we had was word of mouth and engravings. And of course, as you can see, he's got soldiers lined up shooting into an unarmed crowd. You don't see any black men laying around here. Over here, you have a picture of the same situation painted by a black man, and you see a black man coming down right away. Both of them are accurate to a point. The soldiers were lined up. There were 7 of them, and they did fire into the crowd. But did they have justification? Were they afraid for their lives? What's going to happen? Are we going to prove to England that we're a just country, that we're a rule of laws? Or are we going to hang these young men, or what's going to happen? They were arrested, and they're going to go on trial. And believe it or not, John Adams, one of our future presidents, is going to defend them, and he was an arch against England. He hated England. He did not like anything about it, but he was also a lawyer, and he believed in justice. So he took the job of defending them, and this little YouTube here is a brief little snippet from an 8-hour presentation of John Adams's life, what he did do an excellent job. And listen to the words he says. They're true even today. Excuse me.
I am for the prisoners at the bar. In the words of the Marquis of Beccaria, if by supporting the rights of mankind, I shall save from the agonies of death one unfortunate victim of tyranny or of ignorance equally fatal, his blessings will be sufficient consolation to me for the contempt of all mankind. When people are taxed without representation, they are sometimes to feel abused. And sometimes they may even rebel. But we must take care, lest, borne away by a torrent of passion, we make shipwreck of conscience. prisoners must be judged solely upon the evidence produced against them in court and by nothing else. And the evidence we have heard speaks plainly enough, gentlemen. A sentry's post is his castle, and to attack it by English law is an illegal act. Soldiers so assaulted may defend themselves to the death. And the people are crying, "Kill them! Kill them! Knock them down!" And they're heaving sharp, cutting ice, oyster shells, clubs. What are they to do? Behave like stoic philosophers lost in apathy? Disregard these uniforms. Consider the men who wear them. Consider yourselves in such a situation and judge if a reasonable man would not fear for his life. Facts are stubborn things. See, whatever our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictums of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. You see, the law, on the one hand, is inexorable to the cries and lamentations of the prisoners, but on the other hand, it is deaf as an adder to the clamors of the populace. Gentlemen of the jury, I submit to your candor and justice the prisoners and their cause.
What he said was true. You must convict on the face of the evidence, and the face of the evidence was not against the soldiers, although I will agree they were a motley-looking group, and they were English soldiers, but the law is the law. So he was hoping that it would try to calm the public down. Well, it didn't really calm the public down, but it did calm England down, and things kind of went back to kind of an even keel between the mother country and her colonies. And then we have the Tea Act. Oh, merciful heavens. It's not one thing, it's something else. They decided to put a tax on tea and give a monopoly of the tea trade to an English company. Well, now, the tax was not that high. As a matter of fact, you could buy tax cheaper if it was English tax tea than you could from the tea that was being smuggled in. But it was the idea of the thing that the British are still trying to tax us. So we had what's called the Boston Tea Party. As you can see, most of these little YouTubes are only 2 or 3 minutes long.
The growing resentment of the colonists against British control culminated in a dramatic display of rebellion in Boston Harbor called the Boston Tea Party. It all started in 1773, when Britain wanted to save one of its prominent companies, the East India Tea Company, from bankruptcy. It allowed that company to sell surplus tea directly to colonists, bypassing colonial merchants along the way. The colonists were furious. As they saw it, Britain was trying to give a British company a monopoly on American soil. And by bypassing the American tea merchants who traditionally collected taxes, it was cheating the Americans out of money. The colonists decided to boycott East India tea, but for some colonists, a boycott didn't go far enough. Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, a vigilante group intent on protecting colonial rights, saw the tax on tea as an opportunity to rally support against British rule. Adams had organized groups of colonial patriots throughout the colonies to exchange information and monitor British activities. They were called the Committees of Correspondence, and would be crucial in setting up the Boston Tea Party.
Sam proceeded to set up these committees of correspondence, and they started writing back and forth in the different colonies, saying we must stop this. He worked everybody up into quite a state of anger. And when the tea finally arrived, the tax tea from the East India Company, Sam was ready.
In Boston, the unpopular governor, Thomas Hutchinson, an American appointed by the Crown, ordered the ships to remain in the harbor until the tea was unloaded. On December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty organized about 100 Bostonians, disguised themselves as Indians, and boarded the ships.
They chopped open the tea and threw it all into Boston Harbor, destroying quite a lot of money.
Onlookers cheered as Boston Harbor became an enormous teapot. Governor Hutchinson fled the city, never to return. Not a single ounce of the several thousand chests of tea shipped by the East India Company ever reached colonial stores.
There were tea parties in other colonies, but nothing quite as dramatic and as expensive as the Boston Tea Party.
In Philadelphia and New York, mass demonstrations forced tea-bearing ships to return to England with their cargo holds still full. In Annapolis, protesters burned both the tea and the ships, chanting liberty and independence, or death in pursuit of it. Outside of Massachusetts, radical colonists burned tea leaves in solidarity with Boston. Others shook their heads at the destruction of private property and the breakdown of law. The British Parliament was outraged by this blatant act of rebellion and proceeded to slap the colonists with a new set of laws called the Intolerable Acts. They were designed to bring the colonists to their knees, but instead spurred them closer to the battle for independence.
The Boston Tea Party, it has been presented as being a rather outrageous, loud, boisterous affair, but in reality it was done very quietly. And from the reports of people in Boston, they said all you could really hear was the plump, plump, plump of tea chest hitting the water. There wasn't any whooping and hollering. And there is a report that Samuel Adams had told his people, do not try to take any tea. We're not stealing it. We're just dumping it in the harbor. And one man did hide some tea in his pants pocket, and he was discovered. Well, the rest of the troop stripped him naked and made him walk home in the dark, naked. But the Boston Tea Party was the icing on the cake as far as he was concerned. It closed the port of Boston. It changed their charter, no more town meetings. And now we are getting to order we have to lodge soldiers in private homes. And then there's talk of something called the Quebec Act. They never truly decided on exactly how far the borders of Canada were going to be, but now there's talk that Quebec is going to come all the way down to the Ohio River, and they're going to make it Catholic and use French laws. Oh my God, this was just more than the colonists could take. And so instead of bringing the colonies to their knees, as England had planned, all they did was draw them closer together. We have something called the Continental Congress, or the Tea Congress, and this is another little short YouTube. They probably explain it better than I can. The first Continental Congress, which means there will be a second one, right?
I would read into the record for the benefit of those delegates who were unable to remain to close of session the declarations and resolves of this first Congress. Resolved that to the recent grievous acts imposed by Parliament on Massachusetts, we cannot submit, but in hopes that our fellow subjects in Great Britain will restore to us happiness and prosperity, rather than support the Massachusetts militia, we have agreed to pursue the following peaceable measures. To publish a statement of the aforesaid to the inhabitants of British America.
I need no reminders.
2, to enter into a non-importation, non-consumption and non-exportation agreement of British goods.
Which no one will honor.
And 3, to prepare a loyal address to His Majesty.
Which His Majesty will not read. This Congress stands adjourned.
The business of this Congress being concluded, all delegates are respectfully reminded.
The business of this Congress has been to achieve nothing.
In the year of our Lord, 1775.
You carry good news back home, Mr. Payne. Massachusetts has made its cause plain to its sister colonies, and now it will be made plain to Parliament.
I beg to differ, Mr. Dickinson. Nothing has been made plain. All this Congress has shown is that every man in it thinks that he is a great man. Orator, a critic, a statesman, and therefore every man must show his oratory, his criticism, his political ability. If it were moved and seconded that 2 and 3 make 5, we should spend 2 whole days debating the matter and only then pass a resolution in the affirmative.
Well, in that event, Mr. Adams, our adjournment comes not a moment too soon. A toast, gentlemen and ladies. May Boston's troubles soon be at an end, and our people's natural rights as Englishmen be fully restored. May the sword of the parent never be stained with the blood of her children. God save the King.
God save the King.
Another snippet from Sam Adams. As you can see, the First Continental Congress really didn't get anything established. Now, Mr. Dickinson is the leader of the Congress, and he is a peacemaker, so to speak. Now, John Adams is not as bad as his cousin Samuel Adams, who was a real rabble-rouser, along with Paul Revere. They're troublemakers. They like to stir things up even if there's nothing going on. But Adams wanted more to be said. He wanted it to be more forceful. And in a way, it should have been, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe it would have brought the war on sooner, but it really didn't do anything, and the king didn't take any notice of it. So they formed something called the Continental Association, which authorized a committee of safety to force the people to stop buying British goods, all under the leadership of Samuel Adams. They did call for a Second Continental Congress, and this they did meet, and it's there that they're going to sign the Declaration of Independence. The interesting thing is that Georgia did not send any representatives because, in fact, Georgia was outnumbered black slaves more than white people, and they were afraid that
the single most important group of men in the American Revolution are those that met during the years when the Second Continental Congress was in session. The Second Continental Congress creates the United States and wins the Revolutionary War. So what we're going to do is talk about the Congress itself, where it came from, what was going on to make these delegates meet, and what was going on during their meetings. It actually technically lasts for years. So let's go ahead and dive in to the Second Continental Congress. And the Second Continental Congress meets for the first time on May 10th of 1775, and it's going to continue to meet until the end of the war. Now, essentially what the Second Continental Congress is the second meeting of colonial delegates in Philadelphia. Now, these delegates are actually going to move around. They're going to be in Philadelphia for some time in places like Yorktown in Pennsylvania, other times in places like Baltimore, but the seat, really, the area where they're primarily located, is going to be Philadelphia. And this Second Continental Congress essentially has a few tasks. it's going to manage the Revolutionary War, meaning it's going to run the war as best as it can. It ends up writing the Declaration of Independence, and it's going to not just manage war, but essentially run the new country of the United States of America. So really, the Second Continental Congress is the defining moment. Once these men meet, and we'll talk about them in a moment, but once all the representatives of the Second Continental Congress meet, all these famous figures, these founding fathers, you see Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Ben Franklin, John Adams, all these men, once they meet together, basically the fate is sealed. There's going to be a Revolutionary War. There's going to be fighting. So let's talk about what happens to make these men meet and what's going on in the context of the times. So number one, this is the Second Continental Congress. So clearly there was a first. So the First Continental Congress had already met in September and into October of 1774. And they basically met to discuss grievances against the British, especially in regards to what they had done to Boston. And after they left, they agreed to meet again. And they agreed to meet on May 10th of 1775. Except a lot had changed in between September of 1774 and May of 1775. Because in the meantime, fighting had broken out. And we had these shots heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. And according to many, and really when we study the Revolutionary War, Lexington and Concord are really the first battles. So in many ways, the war had already begun. And it's in the midst of the war already beginning that the Second Continental Congress is going to meet. So essentially here, if we look at a map of the colonial North America, Boston had been the hotbed of revolutionary activity. Lexington and Concord took place just west of Boston. And now this American delegation was going to meet in Philadelphia. And they had a variety of responsibilities, and a lot was going to go on. So essentially, the Second Continental Congress is going to meet to discuss how to proceed. There had been years and years of tension. Now fighting had broken out. It was up to these men to decide what to do. If they had all agreed to lay down their arms and say they're sorry, that's probably what would have happened. But of course, we know that isn't the case, and war is going to continue. So, let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen at the Congress. There are three things, essentially, that the Congress is going to have to do. One, they're going to need to run a war. There's fighting going on. A war needs to be fought. Two, they're going to need to design a new government. One of the major reasons why there was fighting and tension in the Revolutionary War itself is because the American colonists, the founding fathers especially, did not like King George III of England, did not support a monarchy. They wanted some form of democracy. So they had to create it. They had to design this new government essentially out of scratch. And then once they designed that new government, they had to run the country. I cannot imagine anything more difficult than these three tasks all at the same time for one group of men. Running a war, designing a new government, and then running a country. Now, there's a few notable men that we see here at the Second Continental Congress. We mentioned a few of them. But I think the most famous are probably George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. And there are dozens more that come in and out during the Congress itself. But just to kind of name a few of these men, Really, we call them the Founding Fathers. And if you were present at the Second Continental Congress, you would be within your right to call yourself a Founding Father. So for instance, like we said, we have Washington, we have Jefferson, we have Franklin, and John Adams, and countless others who helped create this new country. Now let's talk about some of the specific things that the Second Continental Congress is going to do. Because remember, they are tasked with these very important roles: running a country, running a war, designing government, everything under the sun they had to do. So what specifically were they doing, and when did it happen? Well, the first event that really is going to launch their actions is what they do on June 14th of 1775. Now we mentioned the first task that they had was running a war. Well, in order to run a war, you need an army. So on June 14th, they're going to create what's termed the Continental Army, and they're going to appoint General George Washington to lead it. So it should be no surprise that one of the first major actions of the Second Continental Congress is to create an army to fight. Without that army, and without General George Washington leading it, what is this revolution? What's going to happen? Right? Nothing. People need to fight in order for the revolution to actually take place and have a chance of winning. On July 6th of 1775, about a month later, the Second Continental Congress is going to issue its Declaration of Causes, which essentially is the early form of the Declaration of Independence. It's kind of a list of all the grievances that these men are going to send to King George III, saying, here's why we're fighting. It's not yet the firm Declaration of Independence, but it's kind of on the road to that. Now that's going to lead us perfectly into what happens, of course, on July 4th of 1776, when the Declaration of Independence is going to be adopted. And of all the documents that we can talk about in regards to the Revolutionary War, this perhaps is the most famous and most influential. It's a proclamation to the world, not just to the United States and to Great Britain, but to the world, that these colonies, in a unanimous declaration, have broken away from Great Britain and created their own country. Not British colonies, but the new country with a democracy of the United States of America. Now, in order to have this democracy, they needed to literally create it pretty much from scratch. There have been ideas floating around the Enlightenment and things like that, but no country had really existed that embodied these principles of democracy. So, on November 15th of 1777, they issue the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation essentially create a democracy, and this is not the Constitution like we know it today. It's a very different government than what the United States has today, but it's the first attempt at a democracy. And it's the first attempt to show these principles of the Declaration of Independence are going to go into an actual document. And they do. So when we look at here the Second Continental Congress and we look at their big accomplishments, creating an army that wins a war, writing down the list of grievances, writing that Declaration of Independence, explaining why the war was being fought, and then making a new government, they've literally done all the things they had been tasked to do. They successfully, of course, win the war. They successfully designed this new government, and Given that the United States is still around today, they have successfully run a new country. So, the Second Continental Congress, this meeting of the minds of all these founding fathers, is really a success. And the United States owes its history to these men to this day.
Personally, I think it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's pretty much what happened, and saves you from reading 15 or 20 pages. I'm sorry for his writing. His writing is as bad as mine is. But I thought it would be easier for you to hear someone else say it and to see it written down than just to list it. The Declaration of Independence, of course, when it was issued, it wasn't a surprise to the government in England. They already knew about it, and they knew the people who had signed it, and those people were going to be arrested for treason. Let's come back to that. These are the lecture words that you've heard, and it's also on your list, and I think that you need to know what each one of them mean. The suffix reverse is just mentioned in your text, but it's not mentioned in the lecture. It was a letter sent to the king to try to make nice, and the king, of course, didn't even read it. Shouts heard around the world. Lexington conquered April, Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. It just mentioned, if you read your text, you'll see that it General Howe's in New York with his men, and he's heard that the colonials are getting up groups and bands, and they're stockpiling weapons and things. So he decides he's going to go from Lexington to Concord to capture this warehouse. Well, they had missed a lot of things out of their warehouse. They were losing a lot of the little cannons and shot and guns, and they knew that the colonials were stealing them. So they try to go from Lexington to Concord, and on their way in their bright red coats, a group of colonial patriots, I guess you'd call them, showed up, and they took one look at this large group of men and decided to back off. Well, when they tried to back off, the story has been told repeatedly that one of the men stumbled and fell, and when he fell, his gun went off, and when his gun went off, the English thought that they were being fired at, so they fired back. Therefore, we have a big battle ensuing over hundreds of men against a few dozen men. Shouts heard around the world, yes, patriots were killed. The Olive Branch Petition, suffix, everything goes along with it. Pleased with the king to preserve English liberties, and then the Prohibitory Act, or Declaratory Acts. A man called Thomas Paine arrives from England and starts writing, although he himself had been, believe it or not, he was a corset maker in England. Not a very successful one. He comes over here and starts writing a pamphlet called Common Sense, where he condemns the crown about causes the mother countries eating the children. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, writes the Declaration of Independence, although John Adams had been asked to write it, and he said that he was better at speaking than he was at writing, and the job went to Thomas Jefferson. Here's some more words you need to know. Tory, Loyalists, and Patriots. Now, Tory was the name of the party of the king in England. Loyalist was a name that we gave to the people in this country who remained loyal to the king, and patriots were the ones who were wanting to have a revolution. So Tory and Loyalist basically mean the same thing, a king loyal to the king, where the patriots wanted a revolution. Now, when George Washington was given the task of commanding an army, and it happened at the Continental Congress, he showed up in his blue uniform and his white hair, and he looked so good and tall and straight standing there. And when it was announced that they were going to appoint a general, John Hancock thought he was going to be appointed because, after all, he was a master smuggler. He knew all the codes. He knew how to command ships. He had the respect of the country. And he kind of, straightens himself up a little bit, and he's getting ready for John Adams to announce his name. And John Adams announced George Washington. Well, they went, but he doesn't have that much experience. He doesn't know that much about shipping or sailing he's a good-looking man. He's an aristocrat, but he really isn't that great a soldier. But the one big thing in his favor was, and this is where Thomas Jefferson was so smart. Not Thomas Jefferson, but John Adams. John Adams is from Boston. He's a Yankee through and through. Where's George Washington from? He's from Virginia. And Virginia is a southern colony, is it not? And right next to Virginia, you've got North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. You've got 4 states right there. They're all southern. They all have slaves. They all have plantations. And what better way to get the South to come on board when the South wasn't that thrilled about it? If you saw the movie The Patriot, you'll understand the South wasn't having any problems with England. They were happy with the way things were. But anyway, George Washington appointed the general, and he had 3 tasks, and you're going to think they're strange: political and ideological, diplomatic, and avoid losing battles. Well, of course, he has to convince the country, especially the South, and the people out in western Pennsylvania, what is this? What do you mean a war? We're going to fight England, the most powerful country in the world? So he has to do something to move the governments of the different colonies and to get the people on board. Diplomatic, he knows he's going to need some foreign aid, so he sends Benjamin Franklin to France to try to help, because France and England don't get along, so maybe France will give us some help. And France said that they would help as long as we proved to them that we were in it for the long haul. This wasn't just an angry disagreement with the mother country. And of course, the biggest thing was to avoid losing battles. He knew he wasn't going to be able to win that many, but he wanted to avoid losing as many as possible because he didn't want to lose his men. So he had to convince the people to get along and get on board. He had to be diplomatic and get the foreign aid, and he had to avoid losing battles. So what was his makeup of the army? We had no army. We had militia. They'd show up maybe once a month to a local bar and have a few beers and shoot a few targets, but that was about it. They could shoot Indians. But to shoot a man in a red coat? But the regular army was young, unmarried, footloose. Later on, blacks were allowed in. At first, Washington said no blacks. But free and slave eventually were allowed in. Now, that was the regular army, young, unmarried. But for the militia, they're mostly married. They're farmers. They're shopkeepers, like they tell me a little bit later on about one of the battles we're going to get into. They know how to shoot, but they don't know how to fight, and they don't know army discipline. They don't know military protocol. He's got to teach them all of this. I mean, he's got quite a job on his plate, too. So why were the battles of Lexington and Concord fought? Mainly, it was an accident, and General Howe was going to go to Concord to repossess, he thought. And by the way, when he got there, the warehouse was empty. And what was the importance of the Battle of Saratoga, which we'll get to shortly? You need to keep these in mind for when we get into the war. What was the Southern strategy? How was the Continental Army gotten together? I just told you what type of people they were. But how did the general public feel about the Army? And know the percentages of those in this country who were for the war and against the war. Now, these are questions we're going to answer in the next section of the lecture. Okay, what led to the Second Continental Congress? That proclamation line back in 1763 where we were told to move over, your Stamp Act, your other taxes, the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, the Concord and Lexington. These are the things that really led up to it and caused fighting before the war actually began. Okay, how far do we... I don't think I want to go this far. Okay. They met in a place called Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, and they didn't want the common folk, because our founding fathers, they were all educated, they were all rich, they were all white, they were all very well thought of. They were the upper class. They didn't want the common folk, you and me, to know what was going on, so they had the windows closed, and like I said, it was in July. It's going to be hot. A lot of arguing. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and this is important to know. There was 86 alterations made on it when he presented it to Congress. 500 words were eliminated, and most of them were dealing with slavery. It was approved on July the 4th, but it wasn't actually signed until the next month, August. And all the signers were traitors, and like I said, the British already knew, and they were on the list to be arrested as traitors. This picture of Carpenter's Hall. Picture of our founding fathers with George Washington standing there straight and tall. Now I'm going to spend a few minutes on things that are not in your text, but these are things that you might have remembered from your high school South Carolina history. Now, a dandy means a man who gives an exaggerated attention to his personal appearance. And all of the delegates from South Carolina were perceived as dandies because of the way they dressed, the way they acted, the way they talked. They were chosen because of wealth, privilege, and the state was busy setting up a new constitution and state government, and they couldn't spare anybody else. So it was always the rich upper class plantation owner that would go to Philadelphia for the meeting. And when they showed up, they had, lace coming out of under their sleeve of their coat, and they had the they were just dandies. They exaggerated attention to their personal appearance. A man called Thomas Lynch Jr. His father was the original delegate, and he was 26 years old, a lawyer. He was the only father and son team that showed up. He had wealth, he had looks, he had a beautiful wife, productive land, and hundreds of slaves. But he became ill during the course of it, and of course a sea trip was prescribed to go to the Caribbean, and the ship went down, and he died at the age of 30, although he was one of the original people at the Second Continental Congress. Arthur Middleton, and maybe you've heard of the Middleton Plantation around here, also known as Andrew Marvell. He was the oldest of the boys of the family. He's the richest. 50,000 acre plantation, 800 slaves. Very strong patriot. One of the unusual ones from the Carolinas. His father was actually president of the First Continental Congress, and he supported the tarring and the feathering of the tax collectors. He also made arrangements for Charleston's defenses, and he was captured during the war. He was captured for a year before he finally got out, and after the war he served in the South Carolina legislature. Now, he died young too, but it was after the war. He was 45 when he died. This is a picture of him when he was young. We didn't have a picture of him when he was older. Edward Rutledge, he was 26 at the signing, and he headed the South Carolina delegation. And he thought declaring independence was premature. He was more on the, let's sit back and talk a little bit more. And he initially voted no. He was very wordy. He loved to debate. And he and John Adams, did not get along. He also was captured during the war, and his mother was even arrested. But after the war, he managed to regain his wealth, and he served in the legislature and served as our governor. He also died young at 51, 1800, but well after the war. Thomas Hayward Jr., 30, studied law in London, returned home to marry and to run a massive plantation, and he did not like English at all. But he did look down on the colonists, the common folks. He helped draft South Carolina's Constitution. He was a very likable young man, but he was wounded and captured during the war, and after the war he rebuilt the plantation, and he served in the legislature and as a judge, and he lived to be the oldest. He was 63 when he died. So you can see we had some men from South Carolina who were pro or semi-pro. They were chosen to go because, as I said earlier, everybody else was kind of busy, and since they had a large plantation and people to run it, they didn't have anything else to do. Let me ask you a question. Think about it. I don't want an answer, just think about it. Would you have been a patriot? And if you had, what would it have done to your family? Would your whole family been patriots? Would some of them have been loyalists? Now, the loyalists and Tories are those who stayed loyal to the crown. A patriot are those for independence. And in the Northeast, around the Boston area, under Samuel Adams and fellow Revere, there were some radical ones. So you do know the distinction between the loyalists and the patriots. Now, what I want to do is stop right here. I hear thunder outside. I don't know what it's going to do. But give you a chance to think over what we've covered. And then when we come back, we'll get into the actual war.